Hi, my name is Gerald Young, and in this segment we're going to talk about F650 valve adjustment. To get to the valves, we'll have to remove the cylinder head cover, and to remove the cylinder head cover we loosen them up working from the outside to the inside in a crosswise pattern. Now let's take a look inside. Now that we've got the cover off, we need to set the engine at top dead center compression. We've removed the plug on the right side of the engine using a 6mm Allen. Turn the crankshaft, and we turn it, and we want to get to top dead center compression, which would be both cam lobes facing out. We get that, we get close, and then we'll come over here and look, and we'll see that our marks on our sprockets align with the notches on our tensioner tool. One thing that you have to remember is that there's two variations of this engine. There's the carbureted version, which uses a 10 to 1500ths of a millimeter specification for both intake and exhaust valves, and the fuel-injected version, which uses 300ths to 1100ths of a millimeter on intake, 25 to 3300ths of a millimeter on exhaust. Now that I've checked my clearances, I found that I had an intake and an exhaust valve that were out of specification. So now I need to set the crank at true TDC, which means now I have to remove this plug we have a special tool that threads into this hole. The plug came out and fits into a slot in the crankshaft. We'll screw it in hand tight. Now I'll go back to the crankshaft. And I'll try and rock the crankshaft. And then lock the tool into the slot in the crankshaft. And that's true TDC. Yeah. Now that we've locked our crankshaft at TDC, something that you need to make a note of is that these timing marks are always a half a tooth off. Right? So this intake cam is lined up straight. This exhaust cam is half a tooth high. So I need to make a note so that on reassembly, I'll remember to have this a half a tooth high, not a half a tooth low, because that will change the running characteristics of the motorcycle. As we said earlier, we have to remove the camshafts to replace the shims. In the F650 GS service manuals, there's mention of a special tool so that you don't have to remove the camshafts, but through experience we've found that it's a lot easier just to go ahead and remove the camshafts. First thing we're going to do is pull the chain rail off on the side here, and then we'll loosen the cam carrier bolts working from the outside to the inside in a crosswise fashion. Okay, the cam carrier is two pieces, the top piece, the bottom piece. Pull the top piece off. Now the other thing that we want to talk about here is that in the service manual it's going to tell you to remove the cam chain tensioner. There's no need to remove the cam chain tensioner on F650's GS's with ABS. You can't remove it without taking the ABS lines out. So we can leave the tensioner in, then we'll just remove the intake cam. Then the exhaust cam. Use something to hold the chain up to keep it from falling down so you don't have to do a lot of work to retrieve it. Pull the bottom carrier off. And there we have access to the shims. Now that I've removed the camshafts, I can get to my shims. Small flat-bladed screwdriver help me get it off of the bucket. And previously, if you remember, I checked my clearances, and my intake left side was too small clearance. So I've got the shim out. I measure the thickness of the shim, and that shim measures 2.45 millimeters. I take my existing clearance of 0.08 of a millimeter, add it to 245, 2.53, my target clearance. My target clearance is always going to be the widest clearance, and the specifications for this engine is 0.10 to 0.15 of a millimeter, so the wider side is going to be 0.15. 2.53 minus 0.15 is 2.38, and always round up. If the hundredths place is anything other than a 0 or 5, you'll round up. This would be 2.40. So for the correct shim and the correct clearance, I need a 2.40 shim, which would give me 0.13 of a millimeter clearance. Now that I've done my calculations and know what shims to put in or need to be replaced, if you look at the calculations for the intake, I started out with a valve clearance that was too small. My shim size was a 2.45. After the calculations, I end up with a smaller shim size, which is 2.40. So if the valve clearance is too tight, you should always have a smaller shim than what was originally in there. On the exhaust, I had too much clearance, so I started out with a 2.60 shim and then changed it to a 2.65, which tightened up my clearance. So too much clearance, I ended up with a larger shim than what I started with. Now let's reassemble the engine. First thing I want to do is I'm going to put the bottom carrier on, and it's doweled to the head. Then I'm going to put the exhaust camshaft in, and always put the exhaust camshaft in first because your tensioner is on the intake side. So I'm going to lay this in, and I want to remember that my exhaust was a 1/2 tooth high. So it will look, and I want it to end up looking something like that. Okay, now I'm going to put the intake camshaft in. It's a little tricky because the tensioner is still in there. And my line lines up, but I'm a little high on my exhaust camshaft, so I need to drop that tooth down a tooth. Okay, that looks like where I started from. Now I'm going to put the upper carrier on, and it's not doweled. It'll shift back and forth. So I'm going to tighten these down hand tight. And this is a very important step here, because since the top carrier isn't doweled, to locate it to the bottom carrier, we're going to use the chain rail. So we want these down just hand tight. First thing we're going to do is put blue Loctite on the threads. Screw the bottom one in first. Again, blue Loctite on the threads. Snug the bottom one up. Screw the top one in. Okay, but leave it loose. Now we'll torque the bottom one to 10 Newton meters. And then torque the top. And this aligns the upper carrier to the lower carrier. Now we're going to tighten down the cam carrier bolts. We'll tighten them down to 10 Newton meters. Working from the inside out in a crosswise fashion. And once we have these all tightened down, we're going to remove the TDC pin, rotate the crankshaft, recheck our cam timing and our valve clearances. I finished my valve adjustment task. Cylinder head cover back on, bolts torqued in a crosswise fashion working inside to out to 10 Newton meters. Replace the timing locator plug. New copper washer, blue Loctite on the threads, torqued to 23 Newton meters. And that's it.